There's a kind of silence that rots you from the inside out. A stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from the slow, quiet erosion of your voice, your edge, your self-respect. Maybe you've felt it before. You walk into a room, say nothing, try to be agreeable. You nod when you disagree. You stay silent when something cuts deep, not because you're wise or composed, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that speaking might cost you connection. So you bite your tongue. You smile. And something in you folds a little more. We've been sold the idea that being the calm one is a virtue, that staying out of conflict makes us evolved. But the truth is, many people aren't being calm, they're being erased. There's a dangerous kind of quiet that comes not from strength, but from fear. And when you confuse that fear for virtue, you give away something sacred, your presence. Because when you speak only to be liked, when you smile to keep the peace, when you stay silent just to be accepted, you're not being kind. You're disappearing. Nietzsche once said, "Silence is worse. All truths that are kept silent become poisonous." This isn't just philosophy. It's a warning. Because when silence becomes your survival tactic, when you wear the mask of the agreeable, the harmless, the accommodating, what you're really doing is burying your authority alive. Jung called it the persona, the social mask we wear to be accepted. But what happens when the mask becomes permanent? When even you forget who's underneath? There's also a biological truth here. According to mirror neuron theory, people unconsciously mirror what you signal. If your silence comes from insecurity, from fear, from self-erasure, others feel it. They don't admire it. They dismiss it. They treat you as invisible because on some level, you've already agreed to disappear. Think of a figure like the Joker before he snaps. Quiet, forgotten, dismissed. Until one day, that silence breaks, and the world realizes too late what they were never paying attention to. When you're quiet in the wrong way, people don't think you're calm. They think you don't matter. So this isn't a video about becoming louder. It's about how to make your silence louder than any scream. It's about reclaiming presence, power, and identity without having to say a word. There's a quiet desperation behind the need to be understood. A hidden ache that follows every "let me explain," every "what I meant was." You think you're clarifying, but deep down, you're pleading. Not for logic, but for acceptance. The truth is, most explanations are not intellectual. They're emotional. Each time you explain yourself, what you're often doing is whispering a question that sounds like, "Do I still belong here?" It's a pattern rooted in something deeper than communication. It's a trauma response dressed up as reasoning, a leftover survival instinct from the moments you were misunderstood as a child, punished for simply being yourself, or left out for saying something true. So now you overcorrect. You preempt rejection by over-explaining, over-justifying, over-sharing, trying to make yourself small enough to be accepted. But each explanation, though polite, cuts into your authority. Each clarification becomes a silent act of self-negotiation, as if your presence requires constant permission. Internal family systems therapy would call this the pleaser part. The part of you terrified of being seen as difficult, selfish, or cold. It steps forward whenever tension arises, hoping to patch the cracks before they widen. But in doing so, it becomes the very reason no one respects your boundaries. Because it's hard to honor someone who constantly shrinks themselves for harmony. Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why can bear any how." But what if your why has become approval? What if you've traded purpose for likability? That's when the explaining becomes endless. Because you're not speaking to share truth. You're speaking to manage perception. And that's not conversation. That's negotiation with your own worth. Imagine this. Every explanation is a white flag waved by your inner child. Not a rational exchange, but a surrender. And people feel it. They might not know why, but something about you feels unstable, like your presence needs to be earned, not owned. like your words are asking permission, not declaring truth. So before you speak, pause. Ask yourself, am I explaining to clarify? Or am I explaining because I don't believe I'm enough without the explanation? That moment of silence can be more powerful than anything you say, because presence, real presence, doesn't beg to be understood. It simply is, and that quiet confidence, it speaks louder than any defense. Somewhere along the way, being nice became your armor, a way to avoid conflict, dodge rejection, and slip through life unnoticed. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. You comforted others while abandoning yourself. And for a while, it worked. People liked you. You were easy to be around, harmless, predictable. But beneath that politeness, something began to rot. Your dignity. Niceness, when it's driven by fear, isn't kindness. It's submission disguised as virtue. It's the silent betrayal of your deeper self, the one who knows when a boundary's been crossed, when a truth needs to be spoken, when discomfort must be faced. But instead, you chose harmony over honesty. And what you preserved on the outside came at the cost of your authenticity on the inside. There's a difference between choosing silence and being swallowed by it. One is rooted in presence, the other in paralysis. For many, silence wasn't a decision. It was a lesson. Learned young, learned deep. When speaking your truth led to punishment, when emotion triggered rejection, when your voice became the source of conflict, you adapted. You stopped speaking. You became quiet, not because it felt safe, but because it was the only way to survive. Over time, that survival became identity. You told yourself you were low maintenance, easygoing, not dramatic. But the truth was harder to hold. Your silence wasn't peace. It was shut down. What looked like composure was actually a nervous system in freeze. This isn't weakness, it's biology. Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness revealed something chilling. When a living being is conditioned to believe it has no control, it stops trying. Even when escape is possible, it no longer sees the point. Carl Jung warned of this. He spoke of the shadow, the parts of us we exile to remain acceptable in the eyes of others. The more you suppress your true reactions, the more pressure builds in the unconscious. And over time, that suppressed frustration becomes something darker. Resentment, bitterness, even self-contempt. You smile at the world, but inside, you seethe. You become a contradiction, a person who seems calm, but is slowly burning alive. Viktor Frankl once wrote that meaning is not found in comfort, but in the confrontation with truth. If you're constantly avoiding tension, if your life is built around not upsetting anyone, you're not living meaningfully. You're surviving. You're hiding. And what you're hiding from is not others, but the parts of yourself you've deemed unworthy of love unless they're pleasing. This is the tragedy of emotional shutdown. You stop trusting your instincts. You second-guess your truth. You dissociate from your anger, your grief, your power. Because those emotions once made you vulnerable. And now, without realizing it, your silence becomes a cage with no visible bars. Just a heavy numbness where your voice used to live. Neuroscience calls it amygdala hijack. When the emotional brain takes over, rationality shuts down. You freeze. You retreat into stillness. But the outside world doesn't know that. They don't see trauma. They see quiet, and they interpret that quiet as agreement, as weakness, as absence. The more you freeze, the more invisible you become. The tragedy is this. Many who fall into the nice one trap aren't weak. They're powerful souls who learn to mute their fire for the sake of fitting in. But that fire doesn't die. It waits. It waits in the unsent letters, in the swallowed words, in the forced smiles. And if ignored long enough, it erupts, not with grace, but with chaos. So ask yourself, not out loud, but where it matters most, who are you when you're not performing peace? Because that version, the one with raw edges and unfiltered truth, might be the only one capable of being truly respected. Not for their niceness, but for their presence. Nietzsche warned, "Beware that, when fighting monsters, you do not become one. But what if the monster isn't rage? It's your own silence, calcified into identity. What if the real battle is not against the world, but against the part of you that decided long ago that disappearing was the safest way to be seen?" Scan your body. Notice the throat that tightens when you want to speak, the chest that caves in when conflict nears, the jaw that stiffens when emotion rises. These are the echoes of a silence that once saved you, but now traps you. And until you see that, you'll keep mistaking your own absence for maturity. Not all silence is submission. Some silences have weight. They enter a room before the person does. They pull attention not through noise, but through gravity. There are people who don't need to raise their voice to command respect, because their very presence speaks. They don't rush to fill silence. They let silence shape them. In a world addicted to reaction, they embody restraint. And in that restraint, there is power. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch wasn't just a philosophical ideal. It was a posture, a way of being that transcended herd morality, social validation, and reactive emotion. The Übermensch speaks only when the words have the force of transformation, not persuasion, not performance, but truth so grounded it shifts the space around it. This is not the silence of avoidance. It's the silence of sovereignty. We live in an age where speaking first is mistaken for intelligence, where instant replies are seen as confidence. But noise is not leadership. In fact, the more someone needs to prove they're right, the more you can be sure they're not rooted. True presence has no need to dominate verbally. It shapes the atmosphere through energy. That's what makes silence thunderous. Not emptiness, but fullness withheld. The Stoics knew this too. Epictetus reminded us, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." But this isn't about passivity. It's about precision. When you speak only when it matters, people listen when you do. When you no longer speak to be seen, but to reveal something essential, your voice becomes a sword. Not one that swings wildly, but one that stays sheathed and still demands respect. Think of those you admire, the ones whose calm unsettles people more than aggression ever could. Their silence doesn't feel like absence. It feels like presence intensified, as if they are aware of every word not spoken, every thought not shared. That self-restraint becomes an aura, and that aura becomes authority. Before you react, before you explain, before you assert, pause. Ask yourself, am I speaking to defend a wound or to move reality? That 1 second of reflection may be the difference between being heard and being obeyed. There's a kind of desperation that hides behind certainty. The need to always be right, to correct, to counter, to control the narrative. It looks like strength, articulate, confident, in command, but often it's nothing more than the armor of a fragile identity. One that's terrified of being unseen, unheard, or, worst of all, wrong. Behind every compulsive rebuttal, there's usually not clarity, but fear. The fear that if your version of reality isn't accepted, you will somehow cease to exist. This is the ego's game. It doesn't seek truth. It seeks survival. Every argument becomes a battleground not for understanding, but for dominance. And what begins as a conversation quickly devolves into emotional warfare, where winning becomes more important than connecting. But the irony is brutal. The more you need to win, the more you lose. Because needing to win reveals how unstable your sense of self truly is. Nietzsche called this herd morality, the tendency of individuals to cling to popular truths not because they are right, but because they are safe. And when your sense of worth depends on convincing others, you become a mirror, not a master. Reflecting whatever opinions will grant you temporary validation. You don't assert truth. You audition for approval. Look closely and you'll see the signs. The rapid heartbeat when someone challenges your view. The flood of justifications forming before they finish their sentence. The tightness in your jaw as you prepare your comeback. These aren't signs of intelligence. They're signs of identity panic. Because in that moment, you're not defending an idea. You're defending yourself. Or rather, the version of yourself that can't tolerate being seen as incomplete. And here's the paradox. True strength isn't loud. It listens. It pauses. It has nothing to prove, only something to embody. When you can sit in silence while others argue, when you can let someone misunderstand you without lunging to correct them, you've reached something rare, authority born from inner security. Imagine this. Someone challenges you, and instead of reacting, you wait. Not out of passivity, but power. You let the silence stretch. You let your need to win dissolve. And then, maybe, you speak. Or maybe you don't. Because sometimes, the greatest command is knowing when your silence says everything. Manipulators don't fear confrontation. They fear unpredictability. They rely on patterns. Your reactions, your need to explain, your guilt when boundaries are tested. Their power doesn't come from strength. It comes from your predictability. The moment you stop playing the role they've scripted for you, their control begins to unravel, and nothing disrupts manipulation like silence rooted in awareness. The calm observer is dangerous not because they shout, but because they don't. They see through the game and refuse to participate. In narcissistic dynamics, this is lethal. The narcissist feeds off emotional energy, positive or negative. Rage, confusion, panic, apology, it all sustains them. What starves them is stillness, presence without performance, attention without engagement. You become a mirror that reflects their emptiness, and that reflection is unbearable. There's a reason manipulative people escalate when you stop reacting. It's not just frustration, it's desperation. They feel the gravity of their influence slipping away. Tyler Durden in Fight Club never reacted. He set the terms, he created the frame. And that's the paradox of true power. It doesn't need noise. It bends reality by staying centered while others spiral. This isn't about becoming passive or stoic for the sake of pride. It's about self-containment. It's about emotional unpredictability, not from chaos, but from depth. When your silence isn't avoidance, but precision, it sends a message more potent than any argument. I see what you're doing, and I choose not to give it oxygen. Stoic discipline trains this posture. The ability to be provoked, yet unmoved. To hold the gaze, hold the ground, and say nothing. Not because you have nothing to say, but because what you could say would only feed the fire. That kind of silence doesn't suppress. It disarms. You can feel the shift when it happens. The manipulator grows agitated. They repeat themselves, they escalate. But you remain still. Not cold, not detached, just present. And in that presence, their tactics dissolve. Their drama hits a wall. Their need for your reaction turns into a void. This is the silence of power. Not to win, not to dominate, but to refuse the bait. The calm observer doesn't just avoid manipulation, they dismantle it. Not with resistance, but with stillness that can't be seduced. Not all silence is absence. Some silences hold such depth, they become presence itself. In a world obsessed with proving, broadcasting, and performing, the ability to sit in stillness without shrinking is a forgotten power. But the truth is, silence doesn't make you smaller. It reveals who you are when the performance ends. And that version of you, when rooted, no longer needs to shout to be heard. There's something magnetic about someone who doesn't rush to explain, who doesn't overcompensate, who's not moved by the need to be liked. Their restraint doesn't feel cold, it feels composed. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming whole, not through outward approval, but through inner integration. When you are no longer at war with your own contradictions, when the shadow and the mask are no longer enemies, your silence begins to carry weight. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who caused the injury." That isn't passivity, it's power in its most distilled form. It's the kind of authority that doesn't need retribution because it no longer seeks validation in conflict. It rises above the game. It radiates something untouchable. Think of a mountain, unmoving, timeless. It doesn't shout to be seen. It doesn't chase storms. It endures them. And in its presence, everything else recalibrates. That's what real silence can become, a kind of internal mountain. Not cold, not distant, but resolute. When people encounter that kind of energy, they adjust without knowing why. They speak differently. They listen more, because they feel the boundary that your silence draws. Not as a wall, but as a form of sacred ground. But this silence must be built. It must be cultivated, not just by avoiding noise, but by learning to sit in your own discomfort without fleeing, to breathe into the moments you once filled with explanations, to root into your own body until your stillness becomes unshakable. This isn't about avoiding conflict or retreating from the world. It's about becoming so self-contained, so whole, that you no longer leak energy. Your silence becomes armor. Your restraint becomes a message. And your presence, without a single word, begins to speak volumes no voice ever could. There comes a moment when silence has done its part, when the restraint becomes a statement. And if a word must be spoken, it should not be to plead, to defend, or to perform. It should be to end. The most powerful voices are forged in silence, not noise. Presence is not measured in volume, but in weight. Nietzsche said, "He who cannot remain silent cannot rule himself." Power begins there, in the ability to hold tension without breaking, to see through chaos without adding to it. So the next time you feel the urge to explain, to win, to be understood, don't. Let your stillness speak first. And if you must speak, let it be the sentence that does not start the war, but finishes it.